everybody. So in this video, I'm going to go over the PowerPoint on everyday use. So this was the short story that you read for homework last week, Everyday Use by Alice Walker. The same Alice Walker that wrote The Color Purple. And she's brilliant. I think this is probably the one story out of the 6 that you'll have read when it's all said and done. I think this is the one story that is the most understandable, the most straightforward. There's nothing odd about the structure. There's nothing weird about the point of view. I think the imagery and the symbolism come through pretty clearly. The setting and the atmosphere. I don't think that there's a whole lot to be confused about with this story, as there might have been with some of the others. However, don't let that semblance of simplicity fool you, because despite how straightforward it is, there's still just so much going on in this story. It might be one of my favorites. I love it. So, we're going to look at the literary elements and how all of them together help us understand the underlying themes in the story. Alright, so we'll look first at the structure. And again, as I just said, there's nothing odd or different or unexpected about the structure of this story. It follows a pretty traditional plot structure, just like The Lottery did. So our exposition, our sort of introduction, we know that Mama is in the yard awaiting Dee's arrival. She tells us a little bit about her yard, a little bit about her house, a little bit about her daughters, and a little bit about herself. Then we have our rising action, when the tension starts to build. And that is when Dee and Hakeem arrive. We hear Dee's taking pictures of the house, and she wants the butter churn, right? And Mama has already hinted to us that there's tension to be felt, and as the rising action continues, that tension builds even more. And again, it's still a subtle tension. There's no overt conflict happening just yet, and we're not even sure what the conflict really is just yet. We're probably starting to learn a little bit during the rising action as we see how Mama and Maggie interact with Dee, and we get to see more of Dee in person rather than just what Mama has shared about her. Alright, so as the rising action continues to build, so does that subtle tension. The climax happens when Dee says she wants the quilts and assumes she will get them. And then Mama gives the quilts to Maggie instead. That's the climax. That's when all of that tension that was building comes to a head. Right? And it's not this huge moment. It's not this huge event. But it is important and significant. So the climax, Dee wants the quilts, and she's pretty confident she's going to get them. But Mama gives them to Maggie instead. The falling action, right after the climax, Dee and Hakeem prepare to leave, and Dee has a few parting words for Mama and Maggie. And then our resolution, our denouement, where everything's kind of, everything's untied and the story is ending, we see Mama and Maggie, they're just hanging out in the front yard. Dee and Hakeem have left. Life has gone back to normal. They seem content and happy, and for the most part, on the surface anyway, pretty much unaffected by Dee's visit. Their life can go back to normal. and they're pretty happy about it. So, very traditional plot structure. Um, but it's important to realize what that climax is. The quilts. We're going to look next at setting. So, the immediate setting of the story is at the Johnson house, right? We're going to look more at the house when we get to imagery. But that is our first immediate setting, is Mama's house. Part of our setting is also the rural South in the 1960s, maybe early 1970s. And how do we know what that time frame is? First, there's references to pastures, right? So that kind of tells us that we're in a bit of like a country rural setting. There's a reference to Augusta, right? So that implies more than likely Georgia, but I suppose there could be other Augustas in the South. There's also a reference to Johnny Carson. All right, so we know that the story was published in 1973. All right, and we know that Johnny Carson started to become a very popular household name in like the mid-60s, right? So the story's taking place sometime between those years, mid-60s to early 70s. Another important element of our setting for this story has to do with the historical context. And, you know, again, if we're in the 60s and 70s in, you know, the southern states of America, you know, what's happening during this time is, you know, many African Americans were seeking to sort of discover and unearth their heritage and sort of redefine their place in American culture. They were especially interested in elements of African culture that had survived slavery, right? But slavery was still such a fresh wound, and coming through, you know, Jim Crow. They wanted to really focus more on the African element as opposed to the American element. So during this time, we also have the rise of Black Panthers and Black Muslims, and there was this movement, an attempt to sort of resist white-dominated society. And so they were promoting black culture as a way to gain freedom and equality. But a lot of those movements, again, they weren't looking at black culture as it had developed in America, because that was painful and horrible. So instead, they looked to another continent for heritage and tradition. And that in and of itself is not a bad thing. But we'll see where the problems arise. Because every good thing, if taken a different route, can lead to problems. And it's very important to read the story with that historical context in mind. And if you really didn't think about that as you were reading it, don't feel bad. It's probably pretty common to read this story and not really think about what was happening in America during this time that would shed light on Dee and Hakeem and Mama and Maggie and why that tension occurs. Okay. Our point of view. Oh. So we have a first-person narrator, and it's Mama, and I just adore her. She is so very likable. She has a very unique voice. Her diction fiction. It gives the story a sense of realism. It grounds the story in reality. It gives it credibility and believability. She's everything. I love her. On the other hand, though, remember when we have a first-person narrator especially, we're only hearing their side of the story. We only see things through their perspective. And so you always have to question a first-person narrator. You always have to ask yourself, are they telling the truth? Are they presenting us with an accurate account of these events? Do they have any motive for manipulating the events? Do they have any motivation for trying to make us see the story in a certain way? Maybe because they don't want themselves to come off as the bad guy. Maybe because they're trying to protect another character in the story because they don't want us to think that character is the bad guy. Can we trust their sanity? Can we trust their memory? Because sometimes an unreliable narrator is unreliable for very natural reasons and not because they're trying to be sneaky or manipulative. But you have to ask yourself these things. So as much as we might love Mama, we do have to ask ourselves, can we trust her? And the evidence actually says yes, we can. And one reason that we know we can trust her is because towards the beginning of the story, as she's telling us about Maggie and Dee, then after that exposition period, when Maggie and Dee come into the story and we see them, their behavior and their dialogue really matches up with what Mama told us. So what we see for ourselves kind of tells us that Mama was being honest and that it's probably okay to trust her account of this event, right? Some other things about Mama as our narrator. She's very contemplative, meaning she's a thinker. She would probably argue with that and say, no, I'm not smart enough to be a thinker. But she is, she's a thinker. She does a lot of thinking in the first part of the story. There's a lot going on in her mind. It's almost a nervous energy. Almost like that's our clue to prepare for some sort of tension and conflict that's going to happen. And probably Mama herself doesn't even know, at that point. But she's kind of anticipating some tension and conflict as well. She doesn't come right out and say it though. But the things that are going on in her mind, it's like she's moving from one thing to the next. Her stream of consciousness is, it tells us a lot about her. She's also really funny. So she jokes to us, the reader, about Hakeem trying to shake Maggie's hand. And she says, meanwhile, Asalamalakam is going through motions with Maggie's hand. It looks like he wants to shake hands, but wants to do it fancy. Or maybe he don't know how people shake hands. Anyhow, he soon gives up on Maggie. Like, she's just funny, her little observations. Her own trouble with trying to pronounce their names, Dee and Hakeem's names, She says, what happened to Dee? I'll get used to it. Ream it out again. And then, soon we got the name out of the way. Assalamu alaikum had a name twice as long and 3 times as hard. After I tripped over it 2 or 3 times, he told me to just call him Hakeem a barber. I wanted to ask him, was he a barber, but I didn't really think he was, so I didn't ask. So, she's just so real, and she's so funny. And that humor kind of eases the tension for us a little bit as we continue to read. It helps us keep going without feeling like we're intruding. It helps us from getting even more uncomfortable as we read, as we continue to especially observe Dee's behavior and the effect that it has on Maggie. But she's a really funny narrator, and a very believable one, a very likable one. So our other stories that we've read so far, we've had a second person narrator in A Rose for Emily, but this is the first time we've had a first person narrator, and I think, while there are benefits to experimenting with other types of narrators, when you have a good first person narrator, it really makes you connect to the story in a different way. But sometimes that's not what's called for, and that's why, for instance, in Hills Like White Elephants, having a first person narrator would have made that story entirely different. And it would have been something completely opposite of what Hemingway was trying to convey to us. So sometimes the narrator can't be a first person narrator in order for the author to do what they've set out to do. But this story is a little different in the themes that it's, trying to get across to us. And having this first person narrator in Mama really, the story would not have been the same if it had been a third person narrator. Mama makes this story. Alright, so let's move on to the imagery. So the first bit of imagery that we're going to look at is the Johnson house, Mama's house. So the first part is the yard, right? She spends a lot of time in the beginning telling us about this yard. Alright, so she says, I will wait for her in the yard that Maggie and I made so clean and wavy yesterday afternoon. It is like an extended living room. And when the hard clay is swept clean as a floor and the fine sand around the edges lined with tiny irregular grooves, anyone can come and sit and look up into the elm tree and wait for the breezes that never come inside the house. So not only is she using these very specific visual images to describe the yard, but she's also sort of hinting at what the yard means to her. She's taken a lot of care to get the yard ready for Dee's arrival. Not only that, but she makes that mention of how, the breezes from the elm tree don't make it inside the house. So during, really hot weather, the house is probably like an oven, and the yard is nice and cool and breezy. So it's comfortable. It's like a living room, she even says. So there's something very comfortable and familiar about the yard. So the house, we learn it has 3 rooms. She says it is 3 rooms, just like the one that burned down, except the roof is tin. There are no real windows, just some holes cut in the sides like the potholes in a ship, but not round and not square, with rawhide holding the shutters up on the outside. Let me shut the window. I think it's getting a little too breezy. Not going to be able to hear me over the wind. Anyway, and then she says, with rawhide holding the shutters up on the outside. So what that tells us is, it's only 3 rooms, so it's really small. It's got a tin roof. And there's no real windows, and it's almost like holes in a ship, portholes in a ship, except they're not round or square. So there's not even any definition to the windows. It's you can tell that it was not professionally built. And then rawhide holding the shutters up on the outside. We're looking at a very small, basic house, and it's open to the elements. It's just very meager. So that tells us, if we hadn't guessed it already, that we're looking at a family that does not have a lot of money or resources. Let's look at the items in the house, the imagery we get there. The butter churn. You didn't even have to look close to see where hands pushing the dasher up and down to make butter had left a kind of sink in the wood. In fact, there were a lot of small sinks. You could see where thumbs and fingers had sunk into the wood. It was a beautiful light yellow wood from a tree that grew in the yard where Big D and Stash had lived. So a lot of very specific details there, letting us know about this butter churn. Not only do we know what it looks like, but we also know that it was used a lot. We also know that it's made from a tree that grew in her sister's yard. So even what it's made from is connected to the family. And then, of course, the quilts. They had been pieced together by Grandma D, and then Big D and me had hung them on the quilt frames on the front porch and quilted them. One was in the Lone Star pattern. The other was Walk Around the Mountain. In both of them were scraps of dresses Grandma D had worn 50 and more years ago. Bits and pieces of Grandpa Gerald's paisley shirts, and one teeny faded blue piece about the size of a penny matchbox that was from Great-Grandpa Ezra's uniform that he wore in the Civil War. So the imagery around this item not only allows us to sort of imagine what it looks like, but again, we're getting the connection between the item and the family. And this time it goes even deeper. You know, the butter churn, sure, the wood was from a tree in Mama's sister's yard. But this quilt, these are made from scraps of clothing that go all the way back to her great-grandpa, who wore it in the Civil War. So everything in the house has a connection to the family and family history. But these quilts really kind of show that connection and how far back it goes. So her Mama's description, the imagery that she provides to us, all of it focuses our attention on the simple, if not downright meager life that she and Maggie live. They're poor. She also focuses our attention on those household objects and how they are connected to memories and family history. And that imagery is everything to this story. Understanding that they live a very basic, most kind of impoverished life, that they don't have a lot. And that what they do have is just steeped in memories and family history. It's so, that is the story. That imagery is so important. We also get a lot of imagery about the characters. So this is the first time that we're looking at characters as a literary element in a story. Not obviously the other stories we've looked at have had characters, and we've talked about some of them. You know, looking at the story of an hour, you know, we obviously have to talk about Mrs. Mallard when we discuss that story and the themes. But she herself, the character herself, is not a literary element. Same thing with Hills Like White Elephants. Those two characters, the American and Jig, they are the story, but we're not focusing on them. We're focusing on everything around them in that story and what's happening between them. A Rose for Emily, we did look at Emily quite a bit. noticing the imagery around Miss Emily is pretty important to that story. But even still, it plays sort of second fiddle to the other literary elements in that story. The lottery, we kind of looked at some characters in that, but again, the characters are not a focal point. But here, the characters are an element of the story, and looking at these characters helps us figure out the theme more. So Mama gives us descriptions, right? So Mama herself, in the beginning when she's imagining this moment with Dee on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, this is her daydream. She says, out of a dark and soft-seated limousine, I am ushered into a bright room filled with many people. There I meet a smiling, gray, sporty man like Johnny Carson who shakes my hand and tells me what a fine girl I have. Then we are on the stage and Dee is embracing me with tears in her eyes. She pins on my dress a large orchid, even though she has told me once that she thinks orchids are tacky flowers. Then she says, in real life, I am a large, big-boned woman with rough, man-working hands. In the winter, I wear flannel nightgowns to bed and overalls during the day. I can kill and clean a hog as mercilessly as a man. My fat keeps me hot in zero weather. I can work outside all day, breaking ice to get water for washing. I can eat pork liver cooked over the open fire minutes after it comes steaming from the hog. One winter, I knocked a bull calf straight in the brain between the eyes with a sledgehammer and had the meat hung up to chill before nightfall. But of course, all this does not show on television. I am the way my daughter would want me to be. 100 pounds lighter, my skin like an uncooked barley pancake. My hair glistens in the hot, bright lights. Johnny Carson has much to do to keep up with my quick and witty tongue. So we see the contrast here. Mama knows that she is not what Dee wants her to be. She's not thinner, and, I would imagine her skin is probably darker. Her hair is not what Dee would want it to be. She's not really as quick and witty as Dee would want her to be, even though I would argue with that. I think Mama's pretty sharp. But Dee probably doesn't think so. What we do find out about Mama is even though she may not be what Dee wants her to be, she is strong. She is able to do hard work and do the work of men, right? And do it well. And apparently, not only without complaining, but she seems to take pride in it, right? So she might not be what Dee wants her to be, and maybe she feels a little twinge of pang, pangs of hurt and resentment, but at the same time, she likes who she is. She's proud of it. And she's a strong single mother, because we don't hear much about Maggie and Dee's father at all. So we don't know what happened there. Maybe he died, maybe he ran off. Don't know. But he's only mentioned once in passing, and he's clearly not a part of the picture right now. But we learn a lot about Mama there. She also tells us quite a bit about Maggie. Maggie will be nervous until after her sister goes. She will stand hopelessly in corners, homely and ashamed of the burn scars down her arms and legs, eyeing her sister with a mixture of envy and awe. She thinks her sister has held life always in the palm of one hand, that no is a word the world never learned to say to her. So we learn about Maggie's physical appearance, her personality, and her feelings towards Dee. And she goes on, have you ever seen a lame animal, perhaps a dog, run over by some careless person rich enough to own a car? That also gives you a hint as to their economic status. If you own a car, you must be rich. Rich enough to own a car, sidle up to someone who is ignorant enough to be kind to him. That is the way my Maggie walks. She has been like this. chin on chest, eyes on ground, feet in shuffle, ever since the fire that burned the other house to the ground. So we learn a lot about Maggie, and she's a very sympathetic character. You can tell by the way that Mama describes her. She's experienced some trauma, and there are visible signs of that trauma, the scars, the burn scars. And then she also has the relationship with her sister that does not help her heal any faster. And then at the end, we get another description of Maggie when Dee's trying to get the quilts. Mama says, I looked at her hard, meaning Maggie. She had filled her bottom lip with checkerberry snuff, and it gave her face a kind of dopey hangdog look. I don't know what a hangdog is, but I love that phrase, a dopey hangdog look. She stood there with her scarred hands hidden in the folds of her skirt. She looked at her sister with something like fear, but she wasn't mad at her. This was Maggie's portion. This was the way she knew God to work. That Dee gets what she wants. Maggie, not so much. She's just resigned herself to that's how it's supposed to be. So what we get from these descriptions of Maggie, she's small and meek, she's shy and self-conscious, she's not well educated, she's always lived in Dee's shadow, and the only time she comes close to speaking up for herself is when she hears Dee ask for the quilts, and she's in the kitchen and she drops the plates and slams the door. But she still can't even bring herself to come confront Dee and Mama and, put up a fight, for these quilts. She's just, why would she bother when in her eyes, Dee's never told no. Dee gets everything she wants, right? I don't know if we're supposed to feel sorry for Maggie, but Mama sure makes it seem like we are, that we're supposed to pity her. But I think at the same time, I think it's because Mama pities her. But I think at the same time, Mama's kind of ashamed that she pities Maggie. And maybe she realizes that she is at least in part responsible for how Maggie has developed as a person because Dee has always gotten everything. It's almost like Mama couldn't handle Dee. The world can't handle Dee. And Maggie has suffered as a result of that. She's a very sympathetic character, even if we're not supposed to pity her. Now let's look at Dee. What do we learn about Dee? Well, Dee is lighter than Maggie, with nicer hair and a fuller figure. We learn that when she was younger, Dee wanted nice things. A yellow organdy dress to wear to her graduation from high school. Black pumps to match a green suit she'd made from an old suit somebody gave me. She was determined to stare down any disaster in her efforts. Her eyelids would not flicker for minutes at a time. At 16, she had a style of her own and knew what style was. We find out that when she was younger, she had a few friends. We're talking about friends. She had a few. Furtive boys in pink shirts hanging about on wash day after school. Nervous girls who never laughed. Impressed with her, they worshipped the well-turned phrase, the cute shape, the scalding humor that erupted like bubbles in lye. Great. That's a great simile right there. Erupted like bubbles in lye. She read to them. Even her friends, quote-unquote friends, couldn't read either. So she is definitely marked as a character who stands apart from everyone else in this area, mostly because she's educated. She can read. And because she uses that education, she uses that smartness in language, right? So, where she said they're impressed with her, they worshipped the well-turned phrase. It's just the little remarks that he makes. She's well-spoken. And the scalding humor, right? So she's using language to show her education. She's always been very strong-minded. When she gets there, when Dee and Hakeem arrive and they're getting out of the car, Mama says that even the first glimpse of leg out of the car tells me it is Dee. Her feet were always neat-looking, as if God himself had shaped them with a certain style. So, there are certain elements of Dee that set her apart from Maggie at the very least, but probably other people in her life that almost seem to be God-given. Right? Her education, sure, some people have an easier time learning and becoming educated, but that's still not necessarily something that is God-given. You do have to work for that. But your feet, you can do some things to make your feet more attractive, but she's talking about the shape of them. They were just shaped by God with a certain style. And then we see what Dee looks like, how she appears when she and Hakeem get out of the car. A dress down to the ground in this hot weather. Meaning, Mama's like, what are you doing? It's so hot. Why are you wearing that long dress? A dress so loud, it hurt my eyes. There are yellows and oranges enough to throw back the light of the sun. Earrings gold, too, and hanging down to her shoulders. Bracelets dangling and making noises when she moves her arm up to shake the folds off the dress out of her armpits. The dress is loose and flows. Talking about her hair, stands straight up like the wool on a sheep. It is black as night, and around the edges are two long pigtails that rope about like small lizards disappearing behind her ears. Great imagery. Great imagery. I can picture Dee in my head right now. What do we learn from all this description, though? All these images associated with Dee. We learn she's proud. We learn she's confident. We learn she's strong-willed. We learn she's educated. We learn she's almost exotic, right? And while exotic can be very intoxicating and very attractive, it also means she's out of place. That's what exotic indicates, right? If something is familiar and is supposed to be there, then it wouldn't be considered exotic, right? She is a stark contrast to Maggie and Mama, right? Oh, Dee. Alright, so we're seeing those contrasts between the characters and Mama's imagery that she uses to describe all three of them, even herself. We're starting to understand the tension more. We're starting to understand the family dynamics a little more. And at this point, all we've got, like, Dee and Hakeem have only just arrived, so that rising action is just now beginning. But all of that description of Mama herself, and most of the description that we looked at from Maggie comes from the beginning. The one part comes towards the very end. But most of the description that we have of all three women is what Mama gives us early in the story. So if we're paying attention, not only does Mama's own nervous energy and her thoughts kind of jumping all around, not only does that give us a clue that there's going to be some tension, if we're paying attention to how she's describing each character, the imagery that's being used, that should definitely indicate to us that, oh, there's potential for some drama, some family drama to happen. How big or contained it is, we don't know yet. Let's look at the symbolism, though, and see what that starts to tell us. The first symbol that I want to look at, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, is the yard. The story begins in the yard and it ends in the yard. Everything that happens in the house is what's not so nice. The yard, though, the yard is everything, right? She describes how she and Maggie have prepared the yard. She even tells us that she prefers being in the yard to being in the house. The house is stifling, both literally and figuratively. The yard is a place of freedom and control. It is a safe place. And especially if you consider this family's history, they had a house burned down. You know, and Maggie is scarred for life, again, physically and emotionally, because of that. And so, even though it's a brand new house, there's still this feeling of it not being safe. And it gets no airflow. It's very hot and uncomfortable, especially certain parts of the year. But the yard, everything's good in the yard, right? So there's just this idea that we're supposed to kind of pick up on between confinement and freedom. And I don't know that we're necessarily supposed to equate confinement to slavery. I think it's more than that. I think it's all the different ways that these characters have been confined. The house represents that, and the yard symbolizes the opposite. And then, of course, the biggest symbol out of them all, the most important symbol, are the quilts. And I have a feeling most of you picked up on this when you read it. Probably now that I've gone through some of the other literary elements, it's probably starting to click even more what the quilts symbolize. The quilts symbolize family heritage, family, generational bonds. It's not just the connections between these three women that the quilts represent. It's what the connections between these three women and the extended family, and the generation before that extended family, and the generation before that, and before that. So it's family heritage and family bonds. It also represents, these quilts represent resourcefulness, right? Because we are in, when they were being made, right after the Civil War and through the Jim Crow era. And we are in a very poor family in the rural South. And they had to get by with what they had. They had to get inventive, they had to get creative, and these quilts are made from scraps, right? They're using these scraps to make what is needed. It is strength that many of us don't understand. It's such a cool testament to not just this family, the Johnson family, but every other family like them. They are living, these quilts are living pieces of history. Dee, because this is where the problem arises with the quilts. Dee wants to preserve these quilts and showcase them as symbols of cultural heritage. But in doing so, she fails to see the family bonds and the intention behind the quilts. She doesn't see any of that stuff I just mentioned. She just sees it as something to display and show off. Almost like a trophy. Almost like hanging it up. Not to celebrate what the quilt is, or to celebrate where it came from or who it came from, but to prove that they're no longer necessary. They're no longer a part of her life. She has overcome everything that those quilts represent. But Maggie, she not only understands the deeper meaning of the quilts, the heritage, the bonds, the resourcefulness, but she actually knows how to continue that legacy. She can quilt, right? It is really easy, I think, to kind of wonder, like, why is it really that big of a deal that Dee wants these quilts? I mean, she doesn't want to destroy them. She has no bad intentions for them. But are her intentions the best intentions? That's what we're supposed to ask ourselves, right? Knowing what the quilts symbolize. What do we make of Dee wanting them? Why she wants them? And why Mama decides to give them to Maggie instead. Even though Maggie could make more quilts, right? But it's these quilts. These quilts are what are important. Even though Mama says, because Dee mentions, you know, if Maggie has them, she's just going to use them every day, and in 5 years they'll just be rags. And Mama's like, so she can make new ones. She knows how to quilt. And Dee's like, you don't get it. That would be disastrous. And Mama's like, no, that's what happens to quilts. You use them, they get worn out, you make new ones. What do you not understand? So they're both coming at these quilts from very different perspectives. And the question is, what are we supposed to think? Which brings us into the themes of the story. Our first theme that I'm going to look at real quick is actually the theme of education, because you cannot step around the fact that Dee that Mama tells us time and again, and Dee shows us herself that she is more educated. Mama and Maggie are not well educated. Mama says of herself, I never had an education myself. After second grade, the school was closed down. Don't ask me why. In 1927, colored asked fewer questions than they do now. And then of Maggie, she says, sometimes Maggie reads to me. She stumbles along good-naturedly, but can't see well. She knows she is not bright. Dee is educated, obviously. She used to read to us without pity, forcing words, lies, other folks' habits, whole lives upon us too, sitting trapped and ignorant underneath her voice. She washed us in a river of make-believe, burned us with a lot of knowledge we didn't necessarily need to know, pressed us to her with the serious way she read, to shove us away at just the moment like dimwits when we seemed about to understand. Man, there's a lot to unpack in that passage. Maybe we'll come back to that. But clearly, you know, Dee's the smart one. She even says, and then Dee herself says, Maggie can't appreciate these quilts. She'd probably be backward enough to put them to everyday use. And then when Mama's like, yeah, Dee's like, but they're priceless. You just will not understand. You just don't understand your heritage. So now, just Mama pointing out that to us that Dee is educated. Dee actually kind of gets a little mean about it there. That because she's more educated, she obviously must understand everything better than Mama and Maggie. That because Mama and Maggie are uneducated, and that Maggie's not so bright, according to Mama, that there's no way she could be smart about anything. And that, she's leaving, as Dee's leaving, she turns to Maggie, kissed her and said, you ought to try to make something of yourself too, Maggie. It's really a new day for us, but from the way you and Mama still live, you'd never know it. So, there's judgment, a lot of it, on Dee's part. So what do we make of this? Alright, education is a good thing in theory, right? I don't think Alice Walker's trying to tell us that education is bad, by any means. When she's focusing on the yard and the house, and on the contrast between Maggie and Dee, because her focus on the yard and the house is letting us know they're poor. And she's not exactly She doesn't love it, but it's her life. She makes the best of it. Um, and she wanted Dee to be educated. Um, she realizes the benefits of education. But when you mix education with pride and arrogance, and you refuse to be humble about it, then the entire, like what the entire encounter with Dee, culminating with the quilts, what it shows us is that despite her education, Dee still has so much to learn. Education does not necessarily mean knowledge. To be truly educated, you must seek knowledge, but also accept things outside of your own worldview, your own point of view, and not alienate others for not falling in line with yours. Education can lead to a bit of elitism. And that is feeling, what I mean by that is feeling like because you're educated, you are automatically right on matters that don't really have a right or wrong answer. Now, if you're smart and you're given a math problem, your answer might be right, and someone else's who's not as educated as you, their answer might really be wrong. But when you are dealing with social issues, cultural issues, family issues, a lot of issues in politics and religion, there's no real right or wrong answer. And to assume that your answer is the only correct one because you have more years of school behind you than the person you're talking to, that's when we run into problems. And I think that it's, not the most important theme running through this story, but it's pretty important. One you gotta think about. The most important theme, though, is heritage, right? To Dee, her family history represents oppression, right? Something she desperately wants to overcome. Something she probably wants to just forget about completely. So she constructs a new identity. She constructs a new heritage for herself. She changes her name. She adopts a very specific style for her appearance that seems to celebrate African culture, but not her Southern American heritage. So she rejects her true heritage. She wants the butter churn in the quilts so she can display them as artifacts. She doesn't even remember the facts regarding how the history of these objects and how they were made and what they were made from, despite her claims that she is the one who is super in tune with her heritage because she's looking to Africa, right? She can't even remember anything about these items she grew up with that come from her actual blood family, right? She does not understand, let alone appreciate, their intrinsic value to everyday life. Now, Mom and Maggie, on the other hand, the Johnson family history might not be fancy or pleasant, but Mama and Maggie respect it and celebrate it. Despite what happened generations before, great-grandpa fought in the Civil War. So you have to think that there's not so distant relatives born into slavery. That's still relatively fresh at this point. And I'm sure it's something that Mama and Maggie don't like to think about, but at the same time, it doesn't keep them, it doesn't prevent them from still celebrating the family they come from. It's almost like Dee is saying, my immediate relatives, my immediate family heritage is caught up in slavery. And therefore, which through no fault of their own, but therefore not worth my attention. And Mama and Maggie say, yeah, of course that's, great-grandpa, great-great-grandpa, right? But of course that's what they lived through. But they're still our family. That's what our history is. Um, you know, those quilts are infused with the family members whose garments were used to make them and the family members who did the quilting itself. Mama knows Maggie should have the quilts because Maggie understands and respects the quilts, and she will use them in the spirit with which they were made. And, Dee claims that Mama and Maggie do not understand their heritage. But really, it is Dee herself who does not understand or is unwilling to accept her heritage. Understanding and respecting culture, heritage, and tradition does not require these things to be put on display or removed from everyday use. And it's not to say that Alice Walker's trying to say that those movements in the 60s and 70s that looked to Africa and looked to African culture, that those were wrong, that was not the right thing, that they shouldn't have been doing that. But she's saying that you shouldn't do that at the expense of the more immediate family heritage that they had here. Why did it have to be either or? And because I think that's why that whole theme of education is important as well, because I don't think she's trying to say that Dee is wrong for being educated, or that Mama and Maggie are automatically right because they're humble. I think it's about balance, from both sides. That, Mama and Maggie, they are so confined to that house and that immediate family history, and they are not educated enough to start liberating themselves from it. And that might not be such a great thing either. That, it is important to seek out education and grow from it. But Dee went to the extreme, and now education has become a divisive factor between her and her immediate family. And that's not good either, right? So, almost like Walker's trying to say, you can have both. Strive to become more. Strive to lift yourself out of oppression or out of poverty. And education is a tool that can help you do that. But don't get too big for your britches either. Remember where you came from. And this is where you came from, not that continent across the ocean. Celebrate where your ancestors came from, certainly. Look at how their traditions still survived through all of those years of slavery and oppression. Celebrate that, absolutely. Not at the expense of the other. So, I think those are the two themes that come through the most for me. And why Walker wrote this piece, and why she titled it Everyday Use. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, run them by me. If you have any additional comments, anything else you want to say, because I think there's just so much goodness in this story. And you guys might want to talk about it more. If that's the case, I'm here. Otherwise, make sure that you come back to this in order to prepare for the short stories exam.